Hi folks! So far in our discussion of Lefebvre's history of cities, we've moved from the 0 point through the political city, into the mercantile city, and that's taken over by the industrial city, and now we move to our final video here, in which I'm going to discuss the transition, the critical zone, and the emergence of a potential urban society. The first thing to note here is that this critical zone, in my reading, is taking place around 1970 when Lefebvre is writing this book. I believe him to be seeing his time as the critical zone, in which the implosion-explosion is at its most evident and at a peak for him. And that serves his narrative purposes well, but it may also be reasonably descriptive, because he is writing, and incredibly presciently, if I may add, at the onset of globalization proper. Almost all scholars demarcate the beginning of modern globalization with around 1970, 73, somewhere in there. And Lefebvre is right on top of it a year or two before that. So he's already seeing what's going on, right? So let's give a little bit of thought of what this implosion-explosion really is. As he notes, implosion-explosion is a notion that was borrowed from nuclear physics and the construction of the nuclear bomb in particular. And so you may not know this, but you soon will. This is how a nuclear bomb works, right? This is how the implosion, the exploding inward, becomes a greater explosion, right? This is the way that the atom bombs work. And so that notion is this, right? Is that there's a plutonium and core, that's the highly radioactive core on in the core, and that's surrounded by a set of explosives. And the way the bomb starts is when it's ignited, this outer ring of explosives are ignited, and they serve, because of this sort of structure of fast explosives and slow explosives, they function to compress the middle. They sort of explode inward because of the differential explosion speed. And this compresses our plutonium core such that the atoms become so close to each other that the nuclear reaction starts, and you get the massive explosion that is a nuclear weapon, right? So, but this only happens because there is an implosion, a crushing inward, that creates such pressure that it can't help but explode outward in a most devastating sort of way. And the idea is that the industrial city does precisely this. It implodes and then causes an explosion. What it does, right, is that what happens is that the industrial city and industry itself dismantles and fragments the kind of organic unity of the mercantile city, right? There's a sense in which, we still kind of imagine these early mercantile cities as being kind of organically whole, partly because they kind of emerge slowly. Lefebvre might be mixing things up. He's got a bit of a nostalgia for the old city here. and the festivals and things that used to happen in them. But those are, as we've been explaining, as I've been explaining, are just as constructed as the industrial city. But perhaps the rapid and concentrated and excuse me, rational deconstruction and reconstruction of the mercantile city by industrial capitalists and other interests feels like a mechanical kind of unity rather than an organic unity prior. But so this, as industry conquers and fragments the city, it leads to this urbanization of society and the growth of the urban fabric. And the way that happens is through this implosion-explosion, right? Is that as industry moves to the city, as it pulls more people into the city, as it concentrates more and more capital, people, production, economic activity, consumption activity into a small space of the city, it concentrates these forces and creates, what is really a pretty horrible situation, right? Like I said, I don't want to live in a place like that. I'm glad I don't have to. It's not healthy. It's not a very happy place to be, etc., etc. But by pushing all of these people together, suddenly it leads to the explosion and the exodus of people and activity from the center of the city. It doesn't mean that the center of the city and the industrial city goes away. It just means that it explodes and encompasses everything, right? First, we have the richer capitalist class moving outside of the city to escape the smog and the poor people. We get, as I explained before, imperialism seeking out new markets and extending the territory of industry to underdeveloped countries, and increases the extraction of resources from those countries in order to facilitate its own profitable production. We get the emergence of suburbs. We get the emergence of escape summer homes. We get imperialism. We get the increased consumption of mass-produced goods throughout the world, throughout the countryside, and in essence, the implosion of the industrial city leads to the explosion of this urban reality that overtakes and begins to create the urban society, right? And so that urban society refers to this idea that the urban reality modifies the relations of production without being completely sufficient to transform them. It becomes urban, the urban itself becomes a productive force like science. Space and the politics of space express social relationships but react against them. So that is that, in a sense, with this explosion of the industrial city, LEFEBVRE is suggesting that the essence of urban reality, its power relations, its mode of being, changes the relations of production. Excuse me. Without necessarily transforming them. I had some almonds earlier, and it's one caught right in the back of my throat there. And in the same way, right, that science through R&D is a productive force, the urban also serves as a productive force. By concentrating people together, we get knowledge spillovers as new ideas grow faster and faster. So it's just by compressing people and putting them into more and more frequent contact that we get new ideas. For technological innovations, we get new style ideas, we get new cultural practices produced just because we put people together, right? And so the idea here in reflecting on the coming urban society is that the city itself, the urban itself, becomes something greater than industry, and industry becomes subservient to the urban urban society, right? The urban, instead of an urban city, right? I guess that's a little redundant. The urban dominates the industrial, and the industrial comes to serve the needs of the urban. And again, right, this is, refers to this notion that the urban comes to dominate and absorb agricultural production as well as industrial production, as in part. And that it extends the urban fabric across the globe, right? This is first, it's in imperialism, and then subsequent to Lefebvre's writing, we have globalization, right? And so the whole world becomes tied to its larger cities, its global cities, its major cities. And also this notion of the urban fabric and the extension of the urban fabric around the globe refers to all of these manifestations of the dominance of the city over the country. The fact that people from the country mimic urban styles, urban preferences, etc., right? You see this, in my hometown now, that little tiny place that I showed you at the beginning of the year, now they have a gourmet donut shop, right? We used to just be Dunkin' Donuts, but now we have a gourmet donut shop just like the big cities, right? This is that extension of the urban fabric to the smaller places of the world. Been to Krispy Kreme lately, right? That's that, or Shake Shack in Korea. That's that extension of, this sort of center of urban society stretching itself out, right? And so, to begin to wrap Lefebvre's notion up here, he has brought us through these transitions from the political city to the mercantile city to the industrial city, and is suggesting that one possibility going forward in 1970 is the emergence of a global urban society. And I think many of his ideas and many of his predictions have been more or less realized. But when he's writing it, the world that we have today, this integrated urban society, was just a virtual object, something that he was imagining could take place. That society would be integrated on a planetary level, and that some cities would be global in influence, right? And what I will suggest here is that, though obviously a little bit tentatively, is I want to draw a connection from these ideas to some current ideas. one of the current ideas in urban geography in particular is that of planetary urbanization. This is, it's built directly out of Lefebvre's ideas by Neil Brenner in particular, but also Christian Schmidt and some other people, who and Neil Brenner in particular is one of the individuals that brought Lefebvre back into popularity in urban geography and urban theory. I'm pleased to be able to consider him a friend. But there is the idea now that there is, in a sense now there is nothing but urban in our world. Everything in our world is tied to the urban and to cities, right? We're producing for cities, we're connected to cities in culturally, socially, economically, environmentally. There is no longer anything that is really outside of cities, right? What part of Korea is not connected to Seoul, right? What part of China is not connected to Shanghai? All of it, right? All of it is connected. So we have this sort of notion of planetary urbanization floating around today. I'd also point out that this idea that there could be a global city, a city that is the center of the globe and urban society, is also a notion that we'll explore in a few weeks, but is built, I believe, and I think explicitly, from Mao, actually, who talked about global cities as decision-making centers, right? So these global cities are are centers of decision-making. But what Lefebvre does is he takes Mao's idea that the country and the city are in conflict to suggesting that the conflict now is between the centrality of power, the urban concentration of power, and other forms of centrality, like religion, NGOs, the internet, perhaps, right? We can think of other forms, or at least the information that lies at the center of the internet, that form other forms of centrality other than the urban form of centrality of power. And what I would like to close this with is one way that we might think of going even beyond the urban society, right? You can decide if you think we've achieved this urban society. The planetary urbanists suggest that we have indeed reached that point. But if we do reach that point, we also need to think about, well, what comes next? What's beyond that? And one possibility here, which it comes from Paul Virilio, a very interesting intellectual, and from his book, The Information Bomb in 1998, which suggests that information and telecommunications, the internet, represent another move forward, right? Maybe there's something beyond the urban society, the network society, the wired society, the connected society, the knowledge society, the information society. All these are terms that have been used, so they probably don't describe where we're going. But based on this emergence of telecommunications and its relations to power, Virilio suggests that maybe we're moving into something beyond the cities of today and the same kind of urban centrality of power that Lefebvre is discussing. And here are a couple quotes that describe this. He talks about the real city, the kind of cities that we've been talking about, which is situated in a precise place and gave its name to the politics of nations, right? Politics is derived from the term polis, which means city. So national politics is urban, ultimately urban politics. This real city is giving way to the virtual city, a deterritorialized, a misspelled, deterritorialized meta-city, which is hence to become the site of that metropolitics, the totalitarian or global character of which will be plain for all to see, right? So we're moving into deterritorialized means it's a kind of meta-city that's not connected to any particular place. It's beyond these places. It's connected to these places, but it's actually sort of turns the world inside out in Virilio's world. It turns the city inside out. And so that what was inside, the information, the communications that were inside the city come outward and become the shell within which the urban is located, the city is located. So this virtual city becomes a meta-city, which is, a totalitarian or globalitarian kind of city. And we can think about this when we think about social media as a system for engulfing the entire world, right? I mean, Facebook has something like 2 billion daily users. A quarter of humanity uses Facebook on a daily basis, and 2 billion people is a little bit bigger than a city, right? It's bigger than every country on the planet. So, all hail President Zuckerberg. And we can also see this kind of totalitarian character in the collection of data by these firms like Facebook and Google and other sort of surveillance entities out there, and the use of this data collection as a form of exerting new forms of power, throughout the world, right? So Virilio suggests that this inversion into a meta-city, a virtual meta-city, positions the local city, the ones that we live in now, simply as districts, just a borough, one borough among others in this invisible world meta-city, who, and quoting Pascal, the French philosopher from long, long ago, where this world meta-city's center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere, right? So this, like God, Pascal is describing God in this case, right? So the center is everywhere. We're all at the center of this meta-city. But there is no circumference. There's no edge anymore. We're just, somehow sucked up into this centrality, this concentration of power and being. And with that, I will close this series on Lefebvre's history of cities, and hope that provides you with the resources you need to more deeply understand the evolution of cities that we'll be talking about this semester. So, see you next time, folks.